It's Emily OFC Podfic. Flashpoint. Written by It's Emily OFC. Read by It's Emily OFC. Chapter 13. It may have just been the onset of springtime bringing good weather their way, but Tenzō felt an all-encompassing contentedness as he stood at his usual spot behind the island counter this morning. All things in the universe just seemed to be in harmony with one another lately. Life was good. At the station, things had been fairly quiet lately. Call-outs had been minimal and tame. The pace of their training assignments had slowed as well as they worked to clear the backlog. As for his off days, in the week since Kakashi had agreed to recommend him for the lieutenant's exam, Tenzō had begun studying in private. The test was held once per quarter, and he planned to take the one in August, so he still had almost 4 months to prepare. He wasn't ready to make his intentions public just yet. It helped that he and Kakashi had come to an agreement, too. Gone was any anxiety about reciprocity, and although Tenzō would have very much liked to start exploring a relationship now, waiting until it wasn't a violation of department conduct rules was undoubtedly the better course of action. In fact, there was something quite fun about the two of them sharing a secret, Tenzō thought. Between their normal professional interactions, Tenzō was treated to all sorts of clandestine glances and knowing smiles, each one never failing to make his heart flutter at least a bit. It was exciting, like looking forward to an upcoming vacation or slowly climbing the incline towards the peak of a roller coaster track. With so much to look forward to, Tenzō was grateful all over again that he had made that brash decision to move across the country. He was where he should be. Everything was as it ought to be. As he surveyed his crew members, Tenzō suddenly felt very fond of them. Anko and Asuma were back to their usual pastime, loudly cursing while playing foosball. Hayate was reclined in an armchair, scrolling through his phone and coughing at least once every 5 minutes. Kotetsu and Izumo were engrossed in some sort of morning talk show on TV, whispering conspiratorially to one another frequently. Sparky had been asleep on the sofa while Tenzō had been spectating, but the movement of her head rising caught Tenzō's eye, and just as he glanced back at her, he became aware of Kakashi's presence in the doorway to the room. It was a moment before anyone else besides Sparky and Tenzō noticed him, and Kakashi gave Tenzō the quickest wink as a greeting. It made Tenzō's heart jump, and it coincided perfectly with a sharp cry from Anko as she lost the foosball game. The combination of the two made Tenzō nearly drop his spoon into his bowl of milk. The rest of the crew became aware of their lieutenant's presence when Sparky hopped off the couch, trotting over to Kakashi and sitting gracefully in front of him, fully aware that his arrival meant that she was due for some affection. Obediently, Kakashi began petting her head as he leant against the door frame rather than fully entering the room.
"Where have you been all morning?"
Asuma asked, leaving Anko to sulk next to the foosball table and relocating to the kitchen, scrounging around in various cupboards for a desirable breakfast option. It was a fair question. Kakashi always rose before the rest of them, and ever since he'd finished organizing the captain's office, he was usually the first person to take up residence in the kitchen each morning. Kakashi looked up from Sparky, eyes tracking Asuma as he received a couple of slices of bread and inserted them into the toaster.
"Just taking care of a few things," he responded casually.
"What are we overdue on today?" Anko asked, hopping up onto a stool at the kitchen island. This had become her signature question over the past few months, a query to which there was always an answer. Always one training, one inspection, one report due, or another. Kakashi smiled, but Tenzō noted the way his eyes closed as he did. This was a code Tenzō had deciphered at some point, although he wasn't sure when. A smile like this one, eyes closed and upturned into happy crescents, wasn't a genuine one. When Kakashi was actually happy, it reached his eyes, and they stayed open.
"Nothing," Kakashi answered. "We're actually all caught up."
Hayate coughed in surprise, or maybe it was just one of his regular coughs. It was hard to say for certain. "Wait, really?" he asked. Everyone in the room looked a little shocked by the news. Of course, it made sense that they would eventually catch up, but it had seemed like such a lofty goal only a few months ago, and it was a little jarring to hear that they'd achieved it without realizing it.
"Really?"
Kakashi confirmed. He straightened up, ceasing petting Sparky and crossing his arms instead.
"You've accomplished a significant amount of work. You should all be very, very proud. I know I am."
The room was quiet for a moment, but for the sounds of the TV talk show and the scrape of Asuma's butter knife on his toast. The air was charged with something, and Tenzō felt the hairs on the back of his neck raising, though he couldn't quite tell why. "Why are you being weird?" Anko asked, finally breaking the silence. She looked stiff where she sat on the island stool. Kakashi blinked at her.
"I'm not."
"You are," Kotetsu and Izumo reported in unison, one of them using the remote to silence the TV.
"Kakashi,"
Asuma started, abandoning his toast to place his hands on his hips expectantly.
"What's happening?"
Kakashi's eyes shifted between each of them. He opened his mouth to respond, but didn't say anything. The realization dawned on Tenzō at the exact same moment that it fell from Anko's lips. "Oh my God, you're leaving!" Kakashi's face said it all. His expression was somewhere between apologetic and amused, his cheeks blossoming a cherry red as he bit down on his lip. The room was a chorus of gasps and exclamations, with Anko's "unfucking believable" leading the charge. Tenzō, for his part, was silent. He could barely breathe, let alone speak. He was grateful that everyone's attention was focused on Kakashi, because he was confident that his own face must be scarlet by now. Kakashi leaving meant something different for him than it did for the rest of the crew, and he was having a hard time playing that close to the vest, given that his chest felt very much as though it might burst open at any moment from how forcefully his heart was beating against his ribs. He had thought the wait would be longer. It had only been a week, and he'd been prepared to stay in this romantic limbo with Kakashi for at least another month. He was reeling from this unexpected news. Kakashi was waving off the pandemonium now, looking bashful even as he rolled his eyes.
"Who's the new captain?"
Asuma demanded. Kakashi avoided eye contact with them all, choosing instead to look just past Tenzō's shoulder out the window as he responded.
They, haven't found one yet."
Another tangible silence blanketed the room at this. Tenzō tried to process this information, but his brain was still stuck on the agreement he and Kakashi had come to in that small neighborhood coffee shop. He watched as Anko exchanged a look with Asuma. Kotetsu and Izumo looked to Tenzō. Hayate glanced sideways at Kakashi. "Then what?" Hayate asked, not quite finishing his question. Kakashi scratched his nose uncomfortably. Before answering, he pushed off the doorframe, stepping around Sparky to finally fully enter the room. He crossed behind Asuma and Tenzō to round the island and take a seat next to Anko, perpendicular to where Tenzō was standing. Every crew member's head turned to follow him as he moved. Finally, when seated, he answered Hayate's question.
"Bizu has completed his training. He'll be returning along with..."
At this point, Kakashi raised his voice over a few grumbles and at least one cry of protest.
"Along with Captain Senju. The two of them will lead the station until a new captain is selected. Captain Senju wants to help him settle back in, so I'm being reassigned to Station 15.
He finished. At the mention of Captain Senju, the protests got louder. Tenzō didn't have the capacity in the moment to dwell on it, but he clocked how the crew's impression of Kakashi had evolved. He was no longer an extension of Captain Senju, but one of their own.
Guys, Kakashi interrupted, holding his hands up to quiet the noise. It's already been decided. It isn't up to me.
He ran a hand through his hair and sighed.
Have you all forgotten how much you hated me like 3 months ago?
Anko frowned. Well, no, but... She huffed, as if unsure how to finish her thought before moving on from it. When is this all happening? Kakashi pursed his lips. He leant forward to rest his elbows on the countertop.
They'll be here any minute.
At some point, Kotetsu, Izumo, and Hayate had risen from their seats and approached the kitchen. The entire crew was now gathered around Kakashi, trying to take in the unexpected news of his departure. I guess I forgot you'd be leaving eventually, Kotetsu said, prompting a chorus of somber, agreeing voices. Kakashi looked up at him, and then at each of them.
Would you all lighten up, please? I'm not dying.
Us? Anko demanded. You're the one coming in here all sappy and talking about how proud we all should be. Tenzō thought her eyes were looking rather shiny as she made the accusation.
We'll miss you, Kakashi,
Asuma said, an audible sincerity replacing his usual teasing tone. You could have at least told us sooner, Kotetsu said. We could have gotten a cake or something. He doesn't like sweets. The words were out of Tenzō's mouth before he even gave it a second thought. It was the first thing he'd said since Kakashi had entered the room, and suddenly all eyes were on him. He coughed, embarrassed. At least I think he doesn't. A buzz on the intercom from reception mercifully pried everyone's attention away from him then, and Kakashi stood in response.
That's probably them,
he said, making his way towards the door. Anko stood, too, as if she was going to follow him, or perhaps even try to stop him. Instead, she just stood in front of her empty chair, watching like the rest of the crew members, not knowing what to say to mark this occasion. Sparky rose to her feet from where she had been laying down in front of the doorway as Kakashi approached. She wagged her tail as Kakashi gave her a few quick pets on the head.
You'll be fine without me,
he told her, looking into her big brown eyes but very clearly speaking to everyone in the room. He only looked up for the briefest of moments, making eye contact squarely with Tenzō before disappearing down the hallway to reception. It had been at least 10 minutes, and no one had said a word. Tenzō's cereal was soggy in his bowl. Anko was frowning at the ground. Asuma was picking at his surely cold toast. Hayate was still staring at the doorway. Kotetsu was watching the muted TV, and Izumo was watching Kotetsu. Perhaps it was, ultimately, a good thing that the crew had reacted so strongly to the news of Kakashi's departure, because by the time 2 quiet knocks on the doorframe announced the arrival of Ebisu, it didn't seem that anyone had enough fight left in them to greet their returning lieutenant with anything other than resigned acceptance. Hello, everyone. It's good to see you all again, Ebisu said, stepping into the room. It was hard to make out his expression from behind his small, round glasses, but the air of superiority he had constantly projected before was noticeably absent. Tenzō smiled politely, and, in addition to Asuma lifting a brief hand, that was the extent of the response Ebisu's greeting received. He shifted uncomfortably. I have learned a lot during my time with Station 15. I know I haven't always been the best leader to you all, but I am hopeful that we can turn over a new leaf and do things differently from now on. Before anyone else could respond, Anko let out a dramatic sigh. Okay, she said exasperatedly, stepping away from the seat she had been in, Ebisu's usual spot, and motioning for him to enter the room properly. Christ, they must have done a number on you over there. Ebisu seemed to relax in the shoulders, relieved at this response. He straightened his glasses before taking up Anko's offer to perch himself on the kitchen stool. "Look," Anko continued once she was seated on the couch. "I know we weren't always easy to deal with either. We've learned some lessons of our own, so let's just let bygones be bygones, huh?" Ibizu smiled and nodded. "Yes," he agreed readily. "I'd like that." Tenzō watched the interaction with wonder. He wished Kakashi were in the room to see this. The maturity with which Anko had handled this moment was perhaps Kakashi's greatest achievement yet. "All right!" Captain Senju's commanding voice filled the room before she even became visible. When she did appear in the doorway, she was as imposing as always, the insignia on her formal captain's uniform polished and gleaming. "I assume Kakashi has told you all that I'll be stationing myself here for a while," she said, looking around the room to ensure everyone was paying attention. "Good," she said, when her statement was met with nods of agreement. "I plan to delegate most of the day-to-day leadership to Lieutenant Aburame, so please go through him before you come to me for anything." She waited for more nods. "As for today, I'll be in the process of relocating some of my office supplies, so I will be leaving again for now, but I'll be back this afternoon. Again, please refer to Lieutenant Aburame for direction. Call-out procedures should not change." After waiting for a final round of nods, Captain Senju stepped back to depart, but was interrupted by Izumo. "Has Kakashi already left?" he asked, and their interim captain seemed to falter, as if surprised by the question. She paused, gaze softening some as she looked around the room, taking in each crew member's clear interest in the answer to Izumo's question. "No," she answered. "He's cleaning out his own things in the captain's office. I'm sure he'll be back to say his goodbyes before he leaves." She waited a moment longer, likely to ensure that there were no more questions, before taking her leave, the click of her shoes echoing as she made her way briskly back down the hallway out of sight. Tenzō had only been able to endure about 5 more minutes in the rec room before he'd had to slip out to find Kakashi. It hadn't been difficult. He doubted anyone had even noticed. Once assured that they hadn't yet seen the last of Kakashi, the crew had settled back into their seats, and a lively conversation had broken out about what kind of training exactly Ibizu had undergone at Station 15. Tenzō's mind couldn't have been further from the discussion, though. He was entirely caught up in what today meant for him and Kakashi. Since he'd been under the assumption that the wait would be significantly longer, he hadn't really had a chance to think about how the next steps might happen. Of course, he'd thought about being with Kakashi and what it might be like when they were finally free to explore a relationship, but his thoughts had always skipped over this part. How exactly would this start? Would Kakashi call him and invite him out on a date? Did Kakashi even have his phone number? It had been this question in particular, absurd as it was, that had convinced Tenzō to leave the room in search of Kakashi. Of course, nothing as benign as not having Tenzō's number would derail their agreement, but some kind of confirmation wouldn't hurt. Tenzō pressed an ear to the door to the captain's office before knocking, just in case Captain Senju hadn't left the building yet and was meeting with Kakashi. He heard no voices, just the indistinct shuffling of various items. Tenzō knocked. "Come in," came Kakashi's typical response through the wooden door. Tenzō took a steadying breath and pushed it open. Kakashi was in front of the captain's desk. He was facing Tenzō now, but behind him Tenzō could see the corrugated box that he had been filling with his personal effects. "Hi," Tenzō said, not sure why he sounded out of breath. "Hi," Kakashi responded. His lean against the desk looked casual enough, but Tenzō could see that his knuckles were white with how tight he gripped the edge of it. "I can't believe you're finally going back," Tenzō admitted. Kakashi gave him a small smile in response. "Neither can I,"
It's going to be an adjustment.
Tenzō nodded in understanding, not sure what to say next. Deciphering the right way to proceed with the conversation felt like performing calculus in his head. They'd still yet to be forthright about their feelings for one another.
Do you work the same schedule at Station 15? Tenzō asked, feeling foolish even before he'd finished the question. I was just thinking that I could use your help to study for the exam and, it would be easier if we had the same off days.
Kakashi's smile faded and Tenzō winced internally. Had he just fucked up? Did Kakashi think he was trying to avoid what they had agreed to?
It's the same schedule,
Kakashi answered, sounding almost indifferent.
I'd be happy to help.
Thanks, Tenzō replied.
You're welcome.
Tenzō shifted his weight, fighting the urge to fidget. He cleared his throat. So, he said, as casually as he could, I won't be reporting to you anymore, I guess. The desk creaked as Kakashi adjusted his lean.
No, you won't,
he agreed. Tenzō nodded slowly a few times. And that's effective when, exactly? He asked. Kakashi pressed off the desk until he was no longer leaning on it but standing in front of it. He glanced at the clock on the wall before meeting Tenzō's gaze again.
About 15 minutes ago.
Tenzō's heart was racing. Kakashi made no move. The bureaucratic barriers that had kept them apart had suddenly vanished, leaving a vacuum in their place, and Tenzō felt like Kakashi was more visible to him now than he ever had been before. He saw the way the fluorescent light above lit up Kakashi's pale white eyelashes. Draped as they were over his irises, they didn't stop Tenzō from seeing the way the other man's gaze dropped to look at Tenzō's mouth instead of his eyes. It was as much of an invitation as he was going to get, Tenzō realized. Kakashi was waiting like he had promised to do. It was up to Tenzō to decide what happened next. With less trepidation than he would have expected, Tenzō stepped 1 foot forward, and then another, and then one more until they were toe-to-toe in front of the desk, Kakashi exceeding him in height by a few inches, but slouching enough that it was hardly noticeable. At this distance, Tenzō could see that mysterious scar of Kakashi's again. He could see the faintest dusting of freckles that he'd never noticed before. He could see the flush of anticipation creeping its way up Kakashi's pale skin. From there wasn't much that Tenzō needed to do. He tilted his head maybe just a fraction of an inch. He lifted one hand to reach for Kakashi's waist. That was all it took before Kakashi took up the gauntlet, rapidly closing the distance between them, lips crashing forcefully into Tenzō's, his hands gripping Tenzō's biceps. It wasn't the kiss of hesitant new romance. It was something sure and concrete, if a little messy. Tenzō pressed one palm flat against the small of Kakashi's back, ensuring that he was touching as much of the other man as possible. His other hand, without him even having thought about it, found its way up into Kakashi's hair, his fingers tangling in locks that were softer than he had expected. Kakashi's lips were soft, but they weren't still. They moved against Tenzō's wetly, hungrily. They were parted enough for Tenzō to take the kiss deeper, sliding his tongue first along Kakashi's bottom lip and then, receiving no resistance, plunging it into the other man's mouth. He felt Kakashi's hands release his arms and instead slide back to lock behind his neck, bringing them both even closer together. Tenzō tilted his head more, delighting in the feeling of Kakashi's tongue responding to his, the warmth of his body pressed against his. The experience was somehow nothing like he'd imagined, but exactly as it should be. Tenzō had both hands on Kakashi's hips now as they continued to indulge in one another. He took a step to place 1 foot outside of Kakashi's, attempting to get impossibly closer. The movement offset their balance, and Kakashi tripped backwards, leaning back over the desk. Without thinking, Tenzō pressed his palms into Kakashi's hips and lifted, securely seating Kakashi on the desk surface without ever breaking the kiss. Kakashi made a noise of surprise, but stayed put. This new development allowing Tenzō to position himself between Kakashi's knees, finally getting the closeness he'd been after. The move had also apparently knocked the corrugated box on the desk off kilter, as it suddenly crashed to the floor, Kakashi's office supplies spilling out of it noisily. And then they were both laughing. Still kissing, but laughing. Smiles too wide to continue properly, but nonetheless continuing to bite and lick at one another's lips between joyful, carefree, absurd giggles. It was freeing. It was phenomenal. It was so comfortable it felt to Tenzō like they might have kissed 1,000 times before. Finally, when they were both smiling too wide and laughing too hard to keep up even the semblance of kissing, Kakashi pulled back just enough to look Tenzō in the eye, his own gray irises sparkling with something that looked entirely new on him.
"We really shouldn't be doing this in here,"
he said, though he didn't look like he meant it one bit. "Probably not," Tenzō agreed, moving one hand from Kakashi's hip to instead rest it on top of his thigh, still reveling in the privilege of being allowed to touch him. "I didn't come in here to do this, you know." "No?" Kakashi asked, tilting his head to one side. "No," Tenzō confirmed. "I was actually coming to check and see if you had my phone number, you know, in case you wanted to call me and ask me out on a date." Kakashi blinked at him twice before erupting into another bout of laughter. Tenzō watched with a grin on his own face as Kakashi threw his head back in amusement, leaning forward to bite at the other man's jugular when he decided he'd had enough fun at Tenzō's expense. "Hey," Kakashi admonished, pulling one arm towards himself to position his hand on Tenzō's chest, pushing him away gently. "No biting. I still have to go back and say goodbye to the crew. I can't have you leaving marks." Tenzō grinned wickedly. "You can't tell me what to do," he said matter-of-factly. "You're not my boss anymore." It's Emily OFC Podfic.